Hello everyone, I am Amudhan and I have been uh, a long time user of N8 since the early days. And so I think one of the most versatile nodes is the HTTP node, right? You can do a lot with it, but today we are specifically going to look at two different problems or two different cases where the HTTP node becomes really, really useful. And um, that's when you want to use it to implement or add a function to your workflow that an existing node does not already have. And also when you want to say bring some data in or talk to another application for which there is no native N8 node, right? And the HTTP node is obviously not limited to this functionality, and you can do other things with it like web scraping, but today this is what we're focusing on. Um, so let's jump in. But before we go in, quick thing that most of you may already be familiar with, but is worth mentioning, is a quick refresher on APIs. So very simply put, an API is a way for different applications to talk to each other, and usually it is through a standardized format, which these days tends to be JSON. And there's different types of APIs, but what is most relevant here today is HTTP or RESTful HTTP APIs. And there are some methods that you can use to interact with APIs, and I have listed some most common ones that are most frequently used, and you can see them listed here. So there's GET, which is normally used to read data from an API. POST, which is used to kind of ask a question or send data or write data using an API, and often you receive a response for the data that you send. uh, a put and a patch are both very similar. A put request is used to replace existing data that is, that the API is serving to you. A patch request can be sent to update data, and delete is, well, it's very self-explanatory. It can be used to, delete data. And this becomes important because um, standards compliant APIs all follow these request patterns, and those are what we will be using in our examples. And when you build a workflow, you will need to set these up, to talk to these different services that you want to connect with your workflow, right? And so I think it's easy to break this down into a set of steps, a playbook for you to follow, if you will. Uh, so the first thing that you want to do, say you have an application and you want to do something with it that N8 does not currently support. The first thing you want to do is find out if there is an API, right? And you can do this by simply going in to the application documentation, or the website of the service that you're trying to connect to, and start looking for um, API documentation. And the next thing you want to do is, once you've determined that there is an API for you to connect to N8, you want to make sure that there is some kind. Most APIs implement some kind of authentication, so you want to understand how to authenticate with that API in case it is necessary. The third thing is, find the specific function that you need. Say, for example, you want to send a message, or you want to pause Spotify. And right now N8 has it, but if you want, you have to make sure that the function or the thing you're trying to do is supported by the API. And then you just create that request in N8. And we're going to look at examples and screenshots for each of these steps. And then we're going to look at an example uh, that adds functions to N8 for a node that already exists, and for a function for to talk to an application that does not have a native node for N8, right? Um, so like I mentioned before, the easiest way to find out if there is an API is you can check the website, you can read the application documentation, and normally you will find things about the API under the developer section or the integration section. And more often than not, you can just do a Google search for the name of whatever you want to connect and just add API or API documentation, and Google should just find it for you. Here is a quick video of me finding the API for an application called Outline. It's a wiki app that I tend to use, and this is something that you will see in other examples as well. So you can see that I was able to go to the website and find the developer section, and I've also done a Google search, Outline Wiki API, and the first result takes me directly to all of the documentation about the API. So from there, I can start to read it and find the functions that I need, right? Um, so, but before we do that, we need to make sure we have access to the API. And uh, there's two ways right now in n8n's HTTP request node that you can do this. So if you are accessing the API of an application for which n8n already has a node, then there is an option that says used predefined credentials. And you can just select that and pick from your existing credentials. An example of this that you will see later in this presentation is Mattermost. You can just use those credentials to make a request to that API. If you're trying to connect to an app that does not have a node, then you have to find the authentication information in the API documentation and then replicate that setup in n8n. So here I have a screen recording of me again with Outline Wiki, creating, finding the authentication and demonstrating how to create the authentication in the HTTP request node. Um, so you can see I'm highlighting the relevant information as you can go. It says that it needs header authentication using a bearer token and that you can create that key in the account settings. So I'm going to go into the wiki app, go into the preferences, API tokens, and I'm going to create a token. I'm going to give it a name, and I've created that. I'm going to copy that token and then go into n8n and create a new HTTP request node. And under authentication, select generate credential type, header authentication, because that's what we saw in the documentation. And I'm going to give it a friendly name. And you can authorization, and you can see that you need it to be authorization. And then I'm typing in here bearer space, and I'm pasting the API key that I copied from the application, and that's it, right? And you can follow similar steps for any application that you want to connect with an n8n. Just select the appropriate authentication method. Here it was header auth. Select the appropriate one, and then just take the information from the app and put it in. And then the next step, of course, is then to go through the API documentation and find out the function that you want it to do. So in the example I'm showing today, since I'm demonstrating with a wiki application, I'm going to search for a document with keywords, right? And I'm looking for, in my wiki, a branding guideline that was written a while ago. And so this is the API documentation for searching all of the documents in my wiki. And these are all the options that you can use. And you can see at the end of this screenshot that it's a post request and the endpoint is documents.search. And the endpoint is the URL that you make the HTTP request to for that specific function. And you'll see me do that um, in this example here. So in this workflow, I am implementing not one, but two requests for the same app, one which searches for all results and then retrieves the first search result from the wiki, right? So let's take a look. So you can see that it should say documents.search, and there's the endpoint URL I'm using, and I'm selecting the API credential I've already created, and I'm making sure that I'm specifying a query parameter that's as mentioned in the API documentation. And I'm searching for the word brand guideline, and you can see that I'm getting search results. And then I'm using another API call to the same API to retrieve that document. And I've taken the document ID from my previous request and passed it on to this one. So this is a good example of when you can also connect multiple HTTP request nodes to accomplish, a series of things. Say there is an app that you really need multiple functions with that no node is available for. This is something that you can do, right? Um, so this is an example of how to utilize an HTTP request node for an application that does not have a node at all. It is rather straightforward and simple, as you can see, and I hope that you all give it a try. The next example is going to be for using HTTP request to perform a function uh, for which that's not available in the native n8n node. So like I have talked about it earlier. So here what I'm doing is I have a Slack workspace that we use, and we also have a Mattermost chat application that we talk on. But sometimes, when say I take a lunch break, I update my Slack status to say that I'm away, but I may not do so in the other app, right? And it can be quite a hassle. And n8n does have a Mattermost node, but it does not support the function to update your status, right? So this is a workflow that will that will mirror my Slack status into Mattermost every 5 minutes. And so if I'm away for lunch in the next 5 minutes, this workflow should run and automatically let people know that let people know that I'm away, right? So let's take a look at that. So you can see the workflow already here. I'm showing here the API request. Let me just pause it. So this URL is the Mattermost API endpoint for setting setting a custom status, right? And if you go down, you can see that I am passing an emoji and a text. So which is, the icon and the message that is displayed in your status. And the other one is presence. So that's basically the little green circle that says you're online or offline. Interestingly, in Slack and Mattermost, these are two separate things. And you can see here that um, I'm demonstrating here that the statuses are, different and online on either application. And I'm going to go ahead now in Slack, update my status to say I'm going to rest and change my icon to a bed. I'm going to save that. And then I'm going to change my little online green thing to, say that I'm away. And then when I run this workflow, it should get that status and presence from Slack and then replicate it on Mattermost. And if you see that, it says the same thing and says that I'm away, right? So this is an example of using the HTTP request node to just extend an existing node's function. And one key thing that I want to demonstrate here that I may not have pointed out before is if you can see this HTTP request node that I'm using for Mattermost, as opposed to the first example, here I am using authentication as the predefined credential type. So I'm not manually creating any authentication, but rather I'm using the authentication and the credentials that I've already saved for the built-in Mattermost node. So that's one key thing that I want to point out here. I have not, um, I have not here, shown demonstrated, pulling the Mattermost API documentation or, finding that endpoint, but it is very straightforward for most APIs that are documented. And you can just run a similar search and then try a similar workflow out for yourself, right? And for the last example, this is more of a an edge case, so to speak. So
I'm
this
done. One comment. We're running a little bit out of time, so if you could speed this part up a little bit, that would be great.
Yes, of course. So this is about dealing with pagination and rate limiting. So sometimes APIs don't return, all the possible data, and they return it in smaller chunks, because it would be impossible to return a huge data set. And the way they handle this is by returning chunks of data, and this is called pagination. And this video is an example of of a workflow that pulls, posts under from the N8N community forum that says, the tag cloud, and and just, displays them. It iterates through them, different pages, and pulls those posts out. And there's a timeout for 5 seconds to prevent the community forum itself from blocking us with something that's called rate limiting. But let's just jump right in here, and you can see that there's the request that's created, and the query parameter is page, and you can specify the item that you need to iterate upon.
Can you
And
maximize the
yeah,
video for us?
oh yes, sorry. I think, sorry. Yep, here we go.
Thanks.
And yeah, so I'm just going to skip through the execution part because that's just a lot of waiting, and skip here through the output. And you can see that, there it has fetched six different times from the API, which is why it says there are 6 items. And it has fetched, different users and posts that have been made under the cloud tag on the community forum. So this is an example of, something that's a little more uh, advanced or complicated, like an edge case that you may have to deal with, which is pagination and rate limiting. But I think I'm running out of time now, so let's end. You can find me as smamudhan on the community forum, and feel free to ask me any questions. But do we have any time for
Brilliant.
questions?
Yes, we do. Thanks, Mudan. This was really great. Great examples too. I liked the synchronization of the statuses there. We have 2 questions. I think you kind of touched on the second one already. The first one, hang on, let me just go back to sharing my screen.
Yes.
First
Do
one
you need
is,
me to stop? Okay.
oh no, that's fine. First question is, can we use the HTTP node with APIs that uses OAuth? And I think it's kind of related to the second one, right? The difference between generic and predefined authentication.
Yes. Yes, you can use HTTP node with APIs that use OAuth. And if you're doing it for a node that already uses OAuth, you can do the predefined authentication. And if you are not, then you can go into generic, and then you can select OAuth and OAuth2 as a type. And then you can put in your client ID, client secret, and you have to, of course, configure N8N with N8N's callback URL that is provided in the other side. And you can totally do that and connect your account. That's possible. And you can find the documentation on the N8N website. It's quite clear. Um, the next question I'm seeing is, what is the difference between generic and predefined authentication? Predefined authentication is a way for you to reuse saved credentials from existing nodes. So in my example, I had a Mattermost node, but I also used the HTTP request node to make a request to Mattermost API. But instead of configuring a separate credential again just for that HTTP request, I just used those same credentials that was saved for the Mattermost node. That's predefined authentication. Generic authentication is when you configure something that for a node that's not already there, and you might have to do it for every single HTTP request node, and there is not much reusability. Any other questions?
No, I think that's it. Luis, any last minute additions?
No new ones. Some conversations in the threads there in the chat, but I think those were the main ones.
Okay.
All right.
Well,
Thank you.
Amudan, this was a great introduction. Thanks for this overview, and I'm sure we can reuse this video for a lot of people afterwards as well.